arrangements or agencies for dealing with such matters relating to the maintenance of international peace and security may be appropriate to regions. And therefore, that's very much part of our own architecture. Therefore, I'm saying it's partly, in terms of that global architecture, it's partly having to do what the Security Council says, particularly under Chapter 7, and partly what we can do still under the Charter as under Chapter 8. And clearly, as a continent, we have formally recognized the importance, the centrality of the Security Council in terms of that architecture. And you would find this, for instance, stated specifically in the protocol, and the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council, which says in part, for instance, that mindful of the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations, conferring on the Security Council primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and so on and so on. It's in the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council. And I think by and large, we would say that being the position, Africa's position in terms of that international architecture of peace and security has been of benefit to the continent. For instance, if you take the situation as of June 2017, a few months ago, the United Nations had 16 international peace missions, of which 16 in the world, but 9 were on the continent. And we can see the way in which, let us say that all of those deployments were beneficial to the continent, to the extent that we're addressing issues of peace and security in our countries. And they cost almost $6 billion for 1 year. Now, you can imagine that if we had to carry that burden ourselves as a continent for 1 year, that's from July 2016 to June 2017. It's actually $5.9 billion for those 9 missions on the continent. So I'm saying on the way, so the question raised, the position of Africa with regard to that international architecture, I think is really generally positive. But there are issues that have been raised, which is an issue that relates to, it's really a question of leadership. Because indeed, as I was indicating with regard to the UN Charter, it gives all the powers to the Security Council to take whatever decision it takes without relating or asking any question from us. It takes a decision. If it decides to deploy forces, it will take decisions about that deployment and so on. So, but the question has been raised about the leadership of this thing. These are operations that take place on the African continent. Sure, we say thank you very much, United Nations, for that, and including finding the money, and of course we are contributors to the peace budget of the United Nations as member states of the UN. But this question does arise. Now there was the Secretary General of the United Nations, not the current one, the previous one, Ban Ki-moon, set up a high-level group to look at the matter about these peace-keeping missions and so on, make recommendations. It's called the HIPPO. It was led by former president of Timor-Leste, East Timor, Ramos Horta, to look at the whole issue of how this element of the international peace architecture is working. Now, as a response to that, the Commissioner for Peace and Security of the African Union decided to do a similar thing, parallel. Now, that's been published. The results of the initiative of the Commissioner of the AU, Peace and Security, as is published last year as African Politics, African Peace. That's the title of the report, and it says centralizing the primacy of the political within all AU responses is essential. And this will help to ensure that the rising trend of resorting to military enforcement operations will not jeopardize Africa's hard-won peace and security norms. It will enable African ownership of peace processes and the prioritization of conflict prevention and mediation. It will protect the imperative of making armed operations the servant of political strategy. And it says today's emergent emphasis on hard security approaches results in AU responses that are reactive to crisis situations, that are overly dependent on military interventions, and are threatening to embroil the organization in armed conflicts it cannot win. And says this direction is financially burdensome and unsuitable for the African Union. So you see the argument is any conflict, in fact, let me say, the report by, it was commissioned by the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, led, as I was saying, by Ramos Horta, actually comes to the same conclusion. And says, for instance, lasting peace is achieved not through military and technical arrangements, but through political solutions. And political solutions should always guide the design and deployment of United Nations peace operations. It's the same conclusion as this one about African politics, African peace, which was commissioned by the Commissioner for Peace of the UN. And argues very strongly the Horta report about really the urgent need for the United Nations to take seriously its partnership with the African Union. And says, for instance, that the UN and the AU Peace and Security Council and the Commission of the African Union should approach the partnership that's between the UN and these AU organizations as a strategic tool of real value to all organizations. And says, recognizing the primacy of the Security Council for matters of international peace and security, they should define evolving and complementary roles that bring to bear the combined capacities, influence, and experience of each organization in ensuring a coherent response in each context. And this requires not just changes in form, but also in approach and attitude, wherein the organizations recognize that they have distinct comparative advantages that, when leveraged together, can address shared problems more effectively. Now, this is the UN report itself saying this thing. Now, the point is argued in the same way in the report that was commissioned by the Commissioner for Peace and Security of the AU, and talks about the comparative advantages. The comparative advantages, it talks about the capabilities, our capabilities as Africans to understand our own situations better, and therefore to provide the political leadership for the solution of conflicts better than the United Nations can. And so I'm saying that this has also been argued by the Commission, the investigative processes of the United Nations itself. So what I'd like to say, Your Excellencies and delegates, about this is that though I was saying that I think Africa's position in the global architecture as centered in the Security Council has generally benefited the continent, there is a reason this very important issue: who actually leads? Because so far it's been the UN. The UN decides because they've also got the money. But the argument is that, in fact, it would be better that the Africans should lead, where these deployments are going to be on the African continent, and not only lead in a technical sense, but lead by providing the political leadership in order to solve these problems, because the origin of the conflicts are political. They manifest themselves in the way of guns and so on. But it's not just to say, stop shooting, let the guns stop firing. It's also to address the fundamental causes of the conflict. And therefore, the provision of the political leadership by the Africans. Now, that's a matter that's been raised. Therefore, I think the challenge that faces the AU is to follow up on this matter, to engage the United Nations seriously in this discussion, to say, in context of your own report, this one, as I was saying, led by the former President Ramaphosa, to say that there needs to be some repositioning of Africa with regard to deployments of the United Nations that would take place on the African continent. We recognize the centrality of Security Council as provided for in the UN Charter, but nevertheless, here is a consideration which has got to do with much improved peacekeeping on the continent, peacemaking, peacekeeping, and all of that. But that's a particular challenge which we've got to take up as the AU. I don't know if the AU is up to it, but clearly I think it is correct to say that as Africans we need to provide this political leadership. There is, of course, this matter that's been raised quite correctly about financing these peace operations on the continent. And indeed, the report commissioned by the AU Commissioner says the AU cannot expect to have ownership of the continent's peace and security agenda until such time that it is financially autonomous. And it says it is unclear how African ownership can be retained if the AU is seeking funds from others that have their own political priorities for its activities. So that's a matter, of course, as you know, has been discussed in the AU, and therefore decisions taken about new methods of financing, such and such tax on imports and that kind of thing, in order to try and address this particular matter. And indeed, even with regard to this matter also relates, for instance, most specifically even now, to our relations with the European Union. We were talking about this thing with President earlier today about the positions that the EU are taking with regard to Somalia, to say that they are going to phase out, they're going to phase themselves out. So, which impacts on AMISOM, and therefore that I'm saying as part of that global architecture, the matter of our relations with the EU becomes an important matter and is governed by the issue of funds. So that's part of the global architecture centered on the UN. But there are other elements to the global architecture which have got to do with the balance of power globally. They're outside of the UN structure, but very important in terms of what you might call that global architecture. And this relates in particular, I think, to what's happened to the world since the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War produced, as all of us would know, a particular arrangement with the United States emerging as a sole superpower, and it has particular consequences with regard to the matter of peace and security globally, including as it relates to us. Now, I don't want to go into that, but I think we can see a manifestation of this in terms of what's happening, for instance, with regard to the matter of Syria, with the Ukraine, with what the United States called a pivot to Asia, which had to do with China, with the current debate around the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. I'm saying that these are elements which arise out of what has happened to a balance of power globally as a consequence of the end of the Cold War. Of course, we have a direct experience of this as a continent with regard with the matter that was discussed yesterday, which related to Libya. I think the point, we are all familiar with the story of Libya, about how the African Union took decisions on Libya. For instance, there was a communique issued by the Peace and Security Council of the AU on the 10th of March, 2011, which really pointed the way that the AU is engaged with the issue of Libya and so on, including setting up this panel of senior people that President Kikwete mentioned. And exactly a week later, which is March 17, the Security Council takes a decision on Libya which is directly contrary to what the AU had decided a week earlier. And to add insult to injury, they actually refer to the decision of the AU of the 10th of March. They say, we acknowledge the decision of the AU on the 10th of March, but we think otherwise. And clearly, I mean, this was, I'm saying, though it went through the Security Council, it was an expression of that balance of, the change in the balance of power globally as a result of the end of the Cold War. Now, Africa's position in that context, I'm saying, is very weak. The point was made yesterday about, again by President Kikwete, about how this high-level panel of the AU, the ad hoc panel on Libya, how it was going to fly to Libya at some point out of Mauritania, and a young junior French official came to the president and said, you are not going. And they couldn't go. But I'm saying that it's a manifestation of this change in the balance of power globally as a result of the end of the Cold War. And it's weakened radically Africa's position in the context of that global architecture. This matter also arose with regard to Cote d'Ivoire. When we're working with Ivorians, 2004, 2005, and so on, we had a constant battle with France, because France wanted to dictate a particular outcome in the Cote d'Ivoire through the Security Council and had to confront this thing all the time. But in the end, what happened with President Gbagbo removed and all that, let me say even before that, the Security Council passed a resolution which pointed to what was coming. For instance, they called upon all parties to cooperate fully in the operation of the UN forces in Cote d'Ivoire and the French forces which support it, in particular by guaranteeing their safety, security, freedom of movement, and so on. Now, you recall that these same forces that the UN Security Council said everybody must cooperate with, they were very directly involved in the final removal of President Gbagbo and his arrest and his handover to the Force Nouvelle, the rebel groups, and President Ouattara. But they had called for cooperation with this. It's an operation that is very interesting, that UN forces which call themselves peacekeeping, in this case actually intervened militarily to remove President Gbagbo. The AU Peace and Security Council passed a resolution when I think as President Gbagbo was removed, and it said it emphasizes the imperative of sustained efforts by all the concerned Ivorian parties for the promotion of national reconciliation, consolidation of peace, and socio-economic recovery in Cote d'Ivoire. and said, in this regard, the Council welcomes the call for unity and reconciliation made by President Ouattara in his speeches of the 7th and 12th of April 2011, and encourages him to take all necessary initiatives to achieve these objectives, including establishing as soon as possible a government of national unity and reconciliation. That never happened. There's no follow-up on any of those issues. The Security Council has a similar resolution which it takes 1 week after this Peace and Security Council. But clearly there was no determination to do any such thing. Because I'm saying that the changes in Cote d'Ivoire are very much part of this changed balance of forces globally in the context of the end of the Cold War. I must say, finish quickly. There's an issue, of course, that's risen in terms of that global peace and security issue, which is the issue of terrorism. And it's challenging the continent, the whole Sahel. The Sahel is faced with this problem from Mauritania right up to Sudan, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on, Chad. There's no global architecture to deal with the problem of terrorism. Yet it confronts us, so it's one of the challenges that faces us. What do we do as a region? Some steps have been taken with regard to this. For instance, we know that with regard to the Sahel, there is a process which deals with the Sahel as a whole, because the view of all of the countries there, including the EU and the AU, were that it would be incorrect to deal with each one of these countries individually with regard to the matter of terrorism, because the phenomenon, the terrorists move across the Sahel. But I'm saying there is no global architecture to deal with this. But that's a challenge that as a continent we need to answer, to say, well, what do we do in a coherent manner as Africans? There's the issue of the relationship of the Arabian Gulf, the Gulf, with regard to the Horn of Africa in particular. The matter was raised with regard to Libya involvement. Countries in the Horn of, in the Arabian Gulf in the Arabian Gulf in Libya, but also we face this matter with regard to the Horn of Africa. Our colleagues from Somalia will be very familiar with this. I'll come back to it. But that's part of an element of Africa's position with regard to this global issue of peace and security. That's a matter that we still have to address. Then, of course, there's the issue of China. Because I think, again, as we have seen, whenever China, because of China has been very interested in the continent, other countries then get also very interested, if only to try to counter what the Chinese are trying to do. That also impacts on this matter. You have the issue of the election of Donald Trump in the US. I want to mentioning this thing only. This happens soon after, not after the election of Donald Trump. You have the Brexit elections in the UK, the Brexit referendum rather, and we know the outcome of that referendum. Now, I'm raising this thing because it's clear that important in both outcomes. In the election of Donald Trump and in the Brexit vote in the UK, the section of the population that was critical to that outcome is the same. It's people that who feel generally marginalized, left out of this globalization process and so on, unemployed, poor, jobs gone, and hence you see the slogans coming out of Donald Trump, America first, the companies must come back, we must renegotiate all sorts of treaties. But involved in that is this attitude towards immigrants. That's why I'm raising this thing, because if indeed you then get a heightened hostility to the matter of immigrants, as would have arisen, for instance, in the case of Trump, was also a factor in the Brexit thing that might also have an impact in terms of the global peace and security architecture. If you then get, I'm saying, greater hostility towards migrants, particularly for us as Africans, particularly in Europe, and given the fact of the migration of our people across the desert and across the Mediterranean. Another element with regard to this is the presence of foreign military bases on the continent. There is, of course, the outstanding example of Djibouti. It's got US base, French, Spanish, Japanese, Chinese now, Saudi Arabia. I don't know if the African continent has ever discussed this. The implication of one of its member states being kind of this headquarters for foreign military forces. But also you have the US and France. I'm about to finish. The US and France with a very strong military footprint on the continent. And again, these are bilateral agreements these countries reach with each one of our countries. But I think it's a matter that impacts on Africa's position in the global security thing, because the question must surely be answered. What implication does that have? For instance, I've seen figures here, the reports which says, for instance, the US has got a military presence in at least 24 African countries. What are they doing there? And in last year, the Senate Armed Forces Committee in the US Senate, Armed Services Committee, received a report from the US Africa Command, AFRICOM. And AFRICOM said that the command, the African Command, it continues to pursue the objectives of strengthening democratic institutions, spurring economic growth, trade and investment, and advancing peace and security, and promoting opportunity and development throughout Africa. Relatively small but wise investments today offer disproportionate benefits to Africa, Europe, and the United States in future, helping to build African institutions capable of protecting their populations, enabling economic prosperity, and expanding the rule of law. Now that's US military command. It's not military issues, peace and security. They explain themselves, accounting to the US legislature what they are doing on the continent. I'm saying we individually as African countries reach agreements with these military people from France, from the US. They come, and this is part of what they do. Are we agreed? I'd mentioned, for instance, the Gulf, Saudi Arabia establishing a base in Djibouti, and the UAE is establishing has established a base in Eritrea, which has impacted on the security in the Horn of Africa. Let me finish by saying some internal African pressures. For instance, now currently, there's a petition that is circulating in Kenya for self-determination. The argument is that since independence, there are two tribes, as they are called, in Kenya, the Kikuyus and the Kalenjin, who have governed Kenya. And the rest of us, the Luos, the Luya, and so on, have been excluded. And therefore, and this is what they say is going to happen as a result of these recent elections, and therefore it's better to split Kenya into two countries. So it's a petition for the secession of part of Kenya. And it's described in these tribal terms. We, the people of Western Kenya, Luo, Luya, Tesos, Kisi, Korea, Eastern Kenya, Kamba, etc. It's a worrying phenomenon. When President Buhari of Nigeria returned now after these 3 months in the UK, he raised this question with regard to Nigeria about the critical importance of national consensus, that unity, Nigeria's unity is settled and not negotiable. And he was raising this matter because there's a similar discussion that's going on in Nigeria, with some people now trying to raise issues about the resurrection of Biafra and all of this. I've been told to shut up, so I'm not going to go any further about this. So I'm saying that these are some of the elements in terms of the global architecture, and I think we need to build a program of action with regard to this. For instance, with regard to this last matter I'm raising it because it's a domestic issue. But we are very familiar with the fact that colonialism used tribalism as one of its points of entry in order to achieve its purposes. And it's clearly this kind of development which creates a possibility for the rest of the world pursuing its own interests on the Africa to intervene, to take advantages of these divisions among ourselves. Let me finish, Chairperson, by reading 2 paragraphs, because you said we must say what is to be done. Now, this document, African Politics, African Peace, as I was saying, commissioned by the AU Commissioner, it says the African Peace and Security Architecture consists of norms and instruments. The norms are contained in the Constitutive Act, the PSC Protocol, the Memorandum of Understanding between the AU and the RECs, the Tripoli Declaration, and the instruments include mediation, political missions, peacekeeping, enforcement, post-conflict reconstruction, and so on. Sector reform. And it says the compendium of existing commitments to the norms, principles, and instruments of the AU is comprehensive and far-reaching. The challenge facing the AU is primarily one of implementing these existing commitments. And a major part of the implementation challenge is ensuring that the officials and staff entrusted with the continent's peace and security agenda are fully cognizant of their responsibilities and capabilities. And equally important is the domestication and integration of these commitments into national governance and foreign and security policy processes of AU member states. Another part is public education, so that the African public is similarly aware of what their leaders have undertaken to do. Chairperson, that's a very serious agenda, I think, yes, with regard to positioning Africa in this global thing, and I'm not quite sure whether we have the capacity or the will to do that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, President Mbeki. I would argue that indeed we do have the capacity. What we need to reflect on is how we take this process forward. This agenda item requires in itself maybe a 2-day workshop. I will therefore say Wongozi and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation must think as to whether or not we don't need, not next year, but maybe before the end of this year, a working session just on this topic, so that we can actually do justice in reflecting on what needs to be done. Ambassador Mpungo, you've got 7 minutes. 7 minutes. Yes, because you are just responding as a respondent, you are not making a new presentation, and more discussion will be in the group discussions.
Thank you, my sister. Indeed, I'm not making any new presentation, just to, I'll take a cue from Julie yesterday. She always finishes sessions by quoting African proverb. I think I'll start with the proverb. in Julie's language, in Swahili, that mchawi mpe mtoto ale, which basically means give a child to a witch in case you're in doubt on the child's upbringing or survival. President Becky knows my views about the prevailing global architecture in the UN, and probably that's the reason why he wanted to put me on the spotlight. However, I think, as always, and as expected, you have eloquently put across the challenges before us. I don't have to go back lest I take more than my fair share of the time. Certainly, we have huge challenges, and President Becky, I think, traces these challenges from the fall of Berlin Wall and I think end of Cold War. I agree with that because I think the end of Cold War and combined with significant developments in science and technology, especially in ICT, information and communication technology, created a new global environment far different from the one we knew prior to that. And I think it unleashed a lot of challenges in so many different areas. We spent a lot of time yesterday on issues of peace, security, economic inclusiveness, and all these things. And this is part of the challenges that were unleashed after the end of Cold War. As it pushes on universal values of democracy, of rule of law, of good governance, and the challenges that we spent a lot of time discussing yesterday. As it relates to issues of managing the markets, the liberalization, open, we're seeing the collapse of national boundaries into markets and the movements towards integration of these markets, and the recent developments of going back, looking inwards, as we see in the issues of America, making America powerful again, revisiting those trade deals, the developments within Europe and Brexit and the implication. So we have seen all this as an outcome of issues that came after the end of Cold War and developments in science and technology. And a number of these issues were addressed even prior to that. I was reminding President Mkapa yesterday when we were talking about economic inclusiveness. President Mkapa was a co-chair of the ILO Commission in 2002 to 2004. They did a lot of work on issues of inclusiveness and pursuing globalization, but creating safety nets so that everybody benefits from these developments. And I think I was telling him if the world had listened to what they said, we would not be facing the problems that we are facing today. There are issues that we have to deal with on environmental, the renewed concern and care for environment in order to have sustainable development. So there are so many challenges. Just as we are dealing with the issues of peace and security, with the issues of terrorism and other matters that President Becky outlined. Certainly, these need new form of architecture in responding and dealing with them. And especially for us in Africa, when we have resolved to make the 21st century to be ours, then we have to respond in a manner that makes that commitment or ideal meaningful to us. We have a good, Mr. President, we have good precedents in Africa. I think after the end of Cold War, the immediate response by the OU then, I think the 1990 declaration by the African heads of state and government on fundamental global changes and Africa's response. And this was soon after 1989, after the collapse of World War. So Africa has always been in the front line in appreciating these changes and responding. But I think what the President pointed out in his presentation, that our response has not been adequate and strong enough and effective enough to deal with these issues. And this is, I think, the challenge before us this morning in the two working groups that have been created. I think that's all that I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think the respondent has affirmed what I was saying, that Africa is capable of responding. It has in the past, and I'm sure it will do it even in the present. I'll give 1 minute to President Muzoki. Are you okay? Fine now. Can I now ask that all my excellencies come on stage for the group photo? And after we take that one shot, they will be joined by the Prime Minister of Namibia, the ministers who are in the room, the AU rep, the chairpersons of the two foundations, the Institute Wongozi, if the chair is here, as well as the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, the John Tesha, where are you? And CEO of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation. Okay, the other photos we will take in the groups, which will then form part of the, report on who was here. My Excellencies, can I ask you to come up front?
We've done that, yeah. We've done those things, yeah. Yeah. We've done those things. Max here, can you please help me? Yes, I'm glad you came. Oh, he was. I wonder what that meant. Yes, I've always said population.
Bazoma. Okay. Can I ask our Excellencies to join me on stage?
So they are doing it standing?
Yeah. Or do they sit? Which is the better one? Okay. An announcement for the media: we will have a press briefing at 2. We will have a press briefing at 2 p.m. in the main hall. excuse me, can I have the official photographers first to take the photo, and we allow the television set to also capture? Ladies and gentlemen of the media, hello, can you please take immediately and create the space so that the television crew can also take the picture? Okay, can you please move? Vusi, can you please help them to move so that they can just capture once and then? The cell phone gentlemen, can you please just allow the television crews to capture? Can I now have the Prime Minister of Namibia, the ministers who are here, the General Secretary of COMESA, the judge, the Executive Secretary of ICJR? Can you go at the back quickly? John Tesha, Imo Ibrahim. Can I have the chairpersons of Uongozi and Thabo Mbeki Foundation joining the same group? Mr. Fall from the UN. The AU. CEO of Uongozi, Prof. Others, gentlemen, I think they can stand here so that we... Can you do your framing? Well, that's the fourth industrial revolution. You don't need a camera now. Thank you very much. Can I have the line at the back to move, and I have the presenters who were in the different panels to come, and the panelists, so that we take Funmi, Ami, all the panelists from yesterday. You can move now. Hello? You can. You were a panelist. The panelists. Ami?
Yes,
the panelists and those who will be facilitating, presenting in the groups. Are all the panelists here even of today? Rupiah, can you please come? You can take your photos. Well, the other the cell phone lady is the SABC. You can take it. Sophie, you can take your photo. They mustn't intimidate you. Thank you very much. Photo session is complete. We will take the other photos in the two groups of the entirety of all of us. Max, can you please direct where the groups are going to be? Order. Can I now announce where the groups are going to be? Can you please come and announce? Can you announce where the groups are going to be? The one of Chakaya Kikwete, they requested to be here because they want to do a power presentation.
Let me confirm, then I'll come back because all they've set up is the back rooms.
Okay, just give that announcement.
Excuse me? So we're just finalizing the arrangements for the breakaway rooms. Most of them will be in the back behind you. We'll direct you as you come outside, but just give us a few moments to confirm which group will go where, and then we'll make the announcement. Thank you.
Can we have a 5 minutes break as we walk towards the back to be allocated our rooms? We now move to the groups. Can we first allow our excellencies, the heads of state, former heads of state, to actually leave the room, and then we can follow.
Someone who's going to break the news. Does everyone know what group they're in?
They know they've made a choice. There are 3 groups, so we will place ourselves in the groups where we think we can make the best contribution. I am not going to allocate you which group you must go to. You will make a choice. Which is the group? 2 groups, right? Which group that will remain here?
What's your program?
Is there?
Okay, hold on.
Is the one of Chakati? Which is?
No. The group that stays here is group 2, not 3. Group 2. It's Timuriti.
Group 3 remains in the main hall. The other 2 groups will go. If you go on this door behind, there are 2 rooms that are allocated.
There are only 2 groups.
Well, I'm told there are now 2 groups, not 3.
This one stays here.
So one group that is group 2 remains in the main hall. That group is chaired by President Kikwete
Professor Muriti.
and Professor Muriti. That one remains here. The other one is in the room behind this hall. If you go out with President Mkapa.
Good. Morning. Hi. Good. I think you should hold on to this program. you tell people, morning sir, it'll help if you say what the topics are of the two groups. Yeah. So the one who's staying here with Tim Muriti and President Kikwete, we'll talk about aligning policies. The one that's going out, I'm talking about international factors.
Hello, can we please move? Those of us who are remaining here will be dealing with aligning policies. And the one that is going outside will be dealing with international factors. President Kikwete is here. Order. Can we please try and move so that the groups can start?
You had an oversight. You didn't recognize the UN at all.
No,
So
I did.
we didn't join the photo. We were not called.
I did.
My High Commissioner will think we didn't
I
call.
said
You
UN.
say you, AU.
No, I did say AU. No, I said AU. I said UN. There was one fellow who came up from there. I don't know who is he.
We were all seated there.
Oh.
Can we please take our seats, those of us who are remaining here, and try and occupy the front chairs? CEO of Ngozi, can I get the chair of this group to come up? Anthony, where's the new chair? Yeah.
Who is the chair of this group? President Kikwete is going.
Oh, he's leaving.
Mazuki. One is Mazuki.
Can you please bring us?
Mazuki.
No, but we just need to make sure that people are settled.
No, they're settled. It's just that journalists. Iyaqala session. Ubani Okumori. Where's the scribe? Who's the facilitator on this group? Eh? That's why I want Muriti to come here.
I'm looking for him. Shall I go and find him? I don't see him.
Where's Muriti? Just to find out which one is President of Abass and John.
Let me go and find him.
There were no allocations. They can choose where they want to go. Yeah. On the one outside is with international, and the one here
Policy.
policy.
Oh, policy alignment. Here's your man.
Yeah. So who's the chair? Can they bring the chair?
Apparently he's leaving. So it's
Anthony, can
Marzuki.
you please bring?
Marzuki. That's him, right?
Yeah.
President Mazuki.
Yes. One of the issues that we're discussing, he will deal with it. Yeah, that's the last one. Yes. President Kikwete, when we first because he's leaving, so we're having President.
Yeah. This person is the person giving the team. Excuse me, the scenario. I don't know exactly how would be the scenario. I'm going to give the floor to the person who's giving the introduction.
Yes. Yeah.
And then somebody should take notes.
Yeah, somebody will take notes.
And then we would
Report back. The person who's taking notes will then give the report back of the group.
and then there's a discussion.
Yeah. You will facilitate the
My
discussion.
role would be
To chair.
to chair. Okay. Let me bring you a
Can we please be seated? Can I ask those who are participating in this group to please come forward? Photographers, can you please assist so that we start? Photographers, can you please exit the room?
How long it will take? How long it will take?
It will take almost 1.5 hours.
1.5 hours.
Yeah.
Like 10 half. So it will finish about
Half 11. What time is it now? It's half 11.
yes. Midi. 12.
Yeah.
No break, no tea break.
Can we please be seated? Can we please be seated? Those of us who are remaining in this group, can we see the group is going to be chaired by President Mazuki. It's dealing with policy. The one on international factors is on the other room. This is group 2. I'm handing over the chair, President. Can we get the roving mics working?
Well, good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for being here with us. I'm going to give the floor to Professor Tim Murtini, Institute for Justice